Hello. The topic of today's lecture is John Locke's excellent and famous work in political philosophy called the Second Treatise of Government. And in this work, John Locke provides us with another version of a social contract theory. Again, this is Locke himself. Um, he published the Second Treatise on Government in the year 1690, and he was very heavily influenced by Hobbes, and you see this in the sense that he sort of appropriates Hobbes's method, this method of the social contract. And if you'll remember all the steps of the social contract, you remember the first step of any social contract theory is to imagine a life without government, that is, imagine what's called a state of nature. What would things be like without government? And then you start to think of all the problems that there would be in such a state, and that helps to focus your attention on what's actually important about governments to begin with. What ought they do? What should they be like? And then finally you say, okay, so what can we do then? What kind of a government could we propose to fix these problems that any sort of rational person would agree to? And so let's start off with this step one, right? Let's think about the state of nature. Now, Locke's state of nature is somewhat different than Hobbes's. There's a lot that the two have in common, and that'll be certainly a thing I would encourage you to ruminate about in your spare time, is think about, what do Locke's state of nature and Hobbes's state of nature have in common? But of course, what differences are there? And I want to point out what I think is probably the most major difference. It's that for whatever reason, Hobbes, when he thought about the state of nature, thought about sort of people in isolation of each other, right? So he thought about sort of, one person wandering around the state of nature, and what sort of happens when you think about them running into just one solitary other person in the state of nature. And you get, of course, all of Hobbes's reasoning that are detailed in the previous lecture. But Locke, for whatever reason, does not think of individuals in the state of nature. He thinks of a group of people already living together in the state of nature. And this tends to change the way that the state of nature is described, or at least sort of changes the way that we interface with it. And to me, this seems to be the most major distinction between the two of them. But of course, there are a lot of commonalities. There are a lot of ways in which they think very similarly about the state of nature. So again, think along with Locke here, and imagine just what life would be like if you're living with a group of people, and you get sort of dropped, boom, into the state of nature, right? Where the state where there just isn't any government, there aren't any actual laws, or anything like that. If you're living with a group of people, just imagine what life is like. So, I mean, certainly there's going to be a little bit of insecurity, perhaps a feeling of unsafety, but it may not immediately be the kind of, a Hobbesian trap or prisoner's dilemma that you get when you think of just solitary individuals roaming around in a state of nature. After all, you're already in a group here. And so the idea is if you're going to live in a group, which is, probably preferable to just wandering around all by yourself, how are you going to be? How are you going to live? And it seems like, and this is where Locke is, very much the king of sort of, common sense thought in this area. He thinks that there's some pretty obvious rules that arise even in the state of nature, right? That even though there's no actual laws, there's no written rules, he thinks there's some pretty obvious unwritten rules about how to live with other people, even if this people, even with no real experience, just sort of think about some of these things. And honestly, I would encourage you to think about it. So, okay, what would I assume that everybody would agree on in terms of, here are the rules about how to live with this group of people? Again, even if there were no actual governments or written rules or laws or anything like that. And you're probably gonna get these, right? I mean, these are probably some of the very first things that you think about. If we're playing sort of Family Feud style, these would be things that were on the survey of 100 people, absolutely. So clearly, no killing, right? If somebody's going to kill people, they cannot live in a group of other people. Like we're going to be like, nope, you can't do that. We're just not going to tolerate that. No way. Okay, that's obviously as a big rule. Okay. Also, don't interfere with people. Okay, don't it is if somebody's doing something and they're not really hurting you or anybody else, leave them be. Right? That seems to be a pretty general rule of thumb when living in a group of people in general, even with rules in a lot of cases. But especially if there aren't any rules, you're just like, okay, look, you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. As long as you're not hurting anybody else, who cares, right? Uh, and then finally, of course, no stealing, right? You want to say, look, you want to respect people's stuff, right? I mean, that's, I won't take your stuff, you won't take my stuff. That again, it seems very hard to have a community if people don't respect at least those basic rules. There may be certainly more, but these are certainly some of the very, very basic ones I think everybody would put onto any list of what, sort of unwritten rules for how to live with a group of people. And so what's interesting is that these are rules even without governments, right? Even without any laws or anything, people just sort of recognize that these have to be at least part of the rules. What these become to be called by Locke are, he calls these natural, he calls this whole set of things natural law, right? He says the kinds of things that people would expect. And again, these are three examples of rules, but there surely would be at least some others. But the whole set of all that, he calls it natural law because it is the law that applies in the state of nature, right? And so if you ever hear people talking about sort of a natural law or something like that, that's, if they're talking about it in the way that Locke was talking about it, this is what they mean. The kinds of rules that seem so basic that we even have these rules, even if we don't have governments or other laws, right? They're just that basic, okay? And, they come from just plain old common sense. But if we have these natural laws, then there are some corresponding rights that come along with them, right? So for example, if it's a rule that nobody can kill anybody, then it seems like I have a right not to be killed, right? You might call that a right to life, okay? If I have if the rule is, okay, nobody's allowed to sort of, interfere with anybody else as long as they're not, hurting anybody. If everybody has that rule, then it seems like then I can have a right to liberty, right? And that's what it means to have a right to something, is that everybody else has a duty, right? The only reason you have a right not to be killed is because everybody has the duty not to kill you. The only reason you have a right to property is because everybody else has the duty not to steal from you. And of course, that gives us our third corresponding right. So if everybody has the rule no stealing, then of course everyone gets the right to property. That's just what that means to have a right. Everybody likes to talk about their rights. They don't like to talk about their duties, but rights and duties kind of have to go together in just exactly that way. And so from natural law, right, all these rules, no killing, no interference, no stealing, etc., we get these, what he calls natural rights. Okay, these like, for example, life and liberty and property. And this is hugely, hugely important to Western political thought, this notion of natural rights. And think of why they're called natural rights. It's because they come from natural law. That is, the things that just plain common sense tell you have to be rules even in the state of nature. And so these are rights that people should expect and have, even without governments to say that they have these rights. Okay, and that's what's so important about this, right? So these are things that, Locke is going to say, look, these are rights that people have even independently of governments. These are natural rights, right? And so if you have these kinds of rights, even in the state of nature, you should at the very least have these rights if you're living in a commonwealth that is under a government in that sense. And so it's at this point that I wanted to, point something out. Remember, those natural rights were life, liberty, and property. Now that might have had something of a ring to it. You might be thinking of a famous thing. Very often this gets misquoted. People say, oh, it's that bit of the Constitution that talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not the Constitution, right? The Constitution is the legally binding document. This is from the Declaration of Independence, which was just a letter that was sent to King George III saying, hey, we have no intention of continuing to be part of, the part of Britain. That was that. So I think it's very interesting to see some parallels between Locke's views and Locke's writing, especially, and the Declaration of Independence, which was principally authored by Thomas Jefferson. Okay, to see some of the commonalities here. In a lot of ways, Locke is sort of the official philosopher of the American Revolution. And so you can see this idea of natural law that goes, sort of flows both through the Declaration of Independence and through Locke's second treatise of government. In the Declaration, it says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. This is, in fact, the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And if you look at this corresponding piece from Locke, which is, of course, in our reading, he says, to understand political power correctly and derive it from its proper source, we must consider what state all peoples are naturally in. That is the state of nature, right? In this natural state, people are perfectly free to order their actions, dispose of their possessions and themselves in any way they like, without asking anyone's permission, subject only to the limits set by the law of nature. It is also a state of equality in which no one has any more power and authority than anyone else. And so he says, look, so Locke is pointing at this notion of natural law, just like Jefferson is. This has become, again, a very important idea, certainly in American political thought and in Western political thought generally. And in fact, the very next paragraph, right, of the Declaration of Independence starts, this is the famous paragraph, right? He says, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, there's the famous, famous phrase. But compare it to Locke here. Right? He says the state of nature is governed by a law that creates obligations for everyone, and reason, which is that law, teaches anyone who takes the trouble to consult it that because we are all equal and independent, right, that no one ought to harm anyone else in their life, health, liberty, or possessions. This is because we are all the work of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, right? So, I mean, you can see I've sort of color-coded where these ideas just clearly match up. And you might almost accuse Jefferson of plagiarism here, except that he's using very famous ideas that were very much in the air. So, for example, if I were to say, well, to be or not to be, and then go on to say something, I don't have to say, oh, by the way, Shakespeare said that. Don't think I said that, because nobody would think I said that. Educated readers of the Declaration would have known where many of these ideas ultimately came from, and so Jefferson's not trying to get away with anything here. He's stating some ideas that were very much famous ideas, at least among educated English speakers at the time. So. Again, notice how this clear difference between what Jefferson says in terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness versus what Locke seems to indicate in sort of life, liberty, and property, right? Sort of health, liberty, possessions, etc. Right? I mean, why change that, right? If you're going to change something, and we'll come back to that here when we see some of the other big similarities between these two documents, right? The Declaration of Independence talks about the purposes of government. In the Declaration, it talks about securing these rights, that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever, and that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. That's very much a social contract theory idea. And you can see over in Locke where he talks about, he says every man is his equal in the state of nature, and most men are not strict observers of fairness and justice. So his hold on the property, again, there's that P word, that he has in the natural state is very unsafe. And this makes him willing to leave a state in which he is very free, but which is full of fears and continual dangers. If you'll notice that sounds very similar to something that Hobbes said, right? That is fear and continual danger of violent death, right? It's an intentional homage there. So it said he looks for others with whom he can enter into a society for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, which I call by the general name property. Okay, so now again we get this whole life, liberty, property kind of a distinction. And so he says the chief and great purpose of people uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government, again there's this idea of the consent of the governed in there, is the preservation of their property. So this is interesting. Out of the three sort of natural rights that we listed earlier, life, liberty, and property, if you were to ask Locke which he thinks is the most important, he would actually say, he would not say life, nor would he say liberty, he'd say property, which is a little counterintuitive, and you think, what, is this guy's some sort of raving materialist or something. No, that's not it. Really, he thought that your life and your liberty were things that are yours. And so if you can protect property generally, that is, protect things that are yours, that will include protecting your life and protecting your liberty, right? And that's why he sort of, again, he calls these by the general name of property. But again, we see property being very, very key for Locke, and so far not being mentioned at all in the Declaration of Independence. So many things in common. Why is this different? And so I'm going to sort of buzz through some of these other similarities fairly quickly to keep on the main task. But I do want you to sort of go ahead and pause and read some of these things to see just how crazily close the ideas are. So in the Declaration, there's this paragraph about why have a rebellion, and you just see this matching paragraph that says almost exactly the same thing in even some of the same words in Locke as in the Declaration. And again, remember that Locke is written almost a century earlier than the Declaration. You see this idea of cautiousness in beginning a rebellion, right? In the Declaration, it says, well, prudence indeed will dictate the governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And he says, people will put up with a lot. And then Locke says, well, look, such revolutions don't happen with every little mismanagement. He says, people will put up with a lot, right? It's the same thing. And then they both sort of have this, right afterward. I say, well, look, in Jefferson's term, he says, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under despotism, it's their right, their duty to throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security. If you look over at Locke, he says, look, if a long series of abuses, lies, and tricks, all tending the same way. I mean, again, it almost looks like plagiarism. Like, sort of, a modern English teacher would look at this and say, yeah, it looks suspicious to me. But again, Jefferson's not really trying to get away with anything here. The sources of these ideas are pretty well known. Now, of course, back to the issue of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness versus life, liberty, and primarily property. Once we go to the Constitution itself, remember the Declaration of Independence is just a letter declaring the intent of the United States to be independent from Britain. The Constitution itself is the legally binding thing. It doesn't have anything about that in it. And so it talks about, for example, in the Fifth Amendment, when it starts to enumerate specific rights that people have, it says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property, right, without due process of law, right? That's a right in the Bill of Rights. And in the 14th Amendment, we echo that language again. It's one of the post-Civil War amendments. It says, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And so again, once it came time to name our rights, they were named life, liberty, and property in the Constitution. How many times does the pursuit of happiness occur in the Constitution? Well, not a darn one. So again, what's the deal with that being, again, such a famous phrase in the Declaration? Why didn't Jefferson simply just say that, we're created, we have these inalienable rights that were given by our Creator, and that among them are life, liberty, and property? Why didn't he just say that? Well, I mean, there's a lot of ideas about that. My favorite idea is that, it just sounded more crass. I mean, based on the social standards of the time, it would have been considered sort of crude or unseemly for a gentleman to talk openly about money or about their property, right? It seems too sort of crass and money grubbing and stuff, and sort of too low class in that sense, right? And that's honestly, that's why I think he just sort of, instead of using the word property, right, used the flowery phrase pursuit of happiness, right? I mean, they both even begin with P, right? So, for example, if you use a really famous, a really famous formula, right? You talk to anybody of a certain age and say, oh, this is a story all about how my life got flipped, turned upside down. And like everyone else will be able to finish it, tell you how it became the prince of a town called Blair, et cetera, right? You know the way that ends if you're sort of a person of the right age, which is a fairly wide age band, really. So imagine if I say, oh, this is a story all about how my life got flipped, turned upside down, and then I say something else, right? You're like, oh, you're playing on that you're sort of riffing on that pattern. Well, when Jefferson then says life, liberty, and of course people hear and think to themselves property, okay? And he says pursuit of happiness, and we're like, yeah, okay, we know what you meant. Right? You didn't have to say property, but we know you meant property. And so kudos to you for sort of saying this in a very genteel way. So yeah, he meant property. And of course, when you think about some of the causes of the revolution, especially among the elites, like say Jefferson and Adams and Hancock, etc., right? These are these are wealthy people that certainly had their property in mind. Certainly taxation played a major role, etc. Okay, so that's you know that's the interesting story there. All right, so let's move on with Locke. So certainly property is very, very, very important to Locke. And so I want to take this moment to talk a little bit about Locke's theory of property, because you might be asking, and if you're not asking, you should be asking, how in the world does Locke have a theory of property in the state of nature? Doesn't property require laws? Doesn't ownership require laws? I mean, like, how can you say you own something if there are no contracts, no, laws, no police, no courts, no papers that you can sign that are legally binding because there are no laws, right? How can you have property in the state of nature? And this is Locke's explanation of it. He thinks that the concept of property is so commonsensical that it would occur even in the state of nature. Okay, and so let's take a look at some very common sense observations that come out of Locke's idea of property. Okay, so like one of the ways I like to imagine this, or sort of describe this, is just imagine that you're an adult and you're in charge of a daycare center, right? Now imagine that some kid is sitting down, and now of course in the daycare center, none of the toys really belong to any of the kids that are there. They belong to the daycare center, right? But the kids sort of wandering around among it. It's kind of like a little miniature state of nature, right? It's not any of theirs necessarily, but So again, imagine some kid goes over and picks up a little truck and starts scooting around, making little noises the way the kids do. And some other kid comes and just tries and takes the truck away from him, right? As the responsible adult in the room, what do? Right? You say, hey, stop that, right? You stop the second kid. You're like, the first kid seemed to have a reasonable right to it because, it wasn't doing anything. He went over, he sort of picked it up and started playing with it, right? He started, making use out of it, right? And so this mirrors a very interesting idea that Locke gives us it's certainly in the reading. He says that whatever somebody usefully alters from its natural state is rightfully their property. So he gives this example of acorns under a tree. He's like, look, so imagine somebody gathers some acorns, right? When do they actually become his? When does he have some proprietary interest in them? Is it when he eats them or after he boils them? Because you have to boil acorns because they're sort of mildly toxic otherwise. Or is it after he picks them up? And he thinks it's pretty clear that after he picks them up, he has some real interest in them. So imagine, even in the state of nature, again, even without laws, if you go around, you gather some acorns, you put them in a little basket, you're carrying the basket, and somebody comes along, just knocks them out of your hand, scatters them all over the place, right? Didn't that person do something wrong? Didn't they violate a kind of reasonable expectation that anybody should have seen that you had? Right? And so that's the idea. He said that's where we get this notion of property. We get it even in the state of nature from just common sense. Right? And so here's some other things about property that come out of his ideas. Now you might say this. You might say, okay, it stands to reason that if just sort of gathering up those acorns or like picking up a toy and playing with it, if that's if that is what makes something somebody's, then what you probably ought to do is you go find something that everybody really needs, like find something like that's absolutely essential in some sense, like maybe the only well of water in a town, and be like, hey, this is mine, right? Or something like that, right? Something that everybody needs, and just try and gather as much of it as you can, or something like that. Okay. So again, now imagine you are in you run a daycare center, and there's a whole bunch of toys in this daycare, but most of them are lame. Like they're like cup stacking kits or something like that, because that's supposed to be fun, I guess. And those little paddle ball things where there's an elastic in the ball and you're supposed to swing it around, and God knows what you're really supposed to do with that thing. One of those things with like a cup and a string and a ball, and you're supposed to like sort of swing it around to catch the ball in the cup or whatever. Yeah, that's fun for about 4 seconds. And so you got a bunch of crap like that, right? And then you've got like one PlayStation, right? So again, as the responsible adult in the situation, what are you going to do? You're going to have to step in and ration the PlayStation. You can't just say first come, first served, right? You're going to have to say, okay, to keep everybody happy, we're going to have to sort of share this valuable resource that everybody needs. Okay, and so this is a part of what Locke adds again into his theory, right? This is where he talks about leaving as much and as good for others, right? He says as long as ownership is not problematic, right, as would be the case in terms of a critical resource. So imagine you're in a town and there's like one well full for water, and it's the only source of water in the entire town. Do you think anybody in the town is going to accept that some individual person owns that well? No freaking way. Okay. So as long as the ownership of something itself isn't problematic, then yeah, right. Then the normal common sense continues to apply. That if you gathered it and if you're making some good use of something, it's yours, right? And then finally, just imagine somebody has, gone to a daycare center and decided, you know what, I'm just going to put all the toys into one big pile, and I'm going to guard this pile from everybody else, right? So again, just like you might say, okay, look, if you think that just gathering those acorns made you own them, Locke, couldn't you just then say, couldn't somebody just go and gather everything, just gather all of them, like gather every acorn, right? Then all the acorns are theirs, haha, right? Pick all the fruit and gather all the wheat and just like start stacking it up, and it's like, it's mine because I just grabbed it first, right? I mean, he's like, is that really legitimate? And Locke says, well, of course that's not legitimate. Common sense tells you that even in the state of nature, nobody would recognize that kind of a claim. The idea is that Locke says, look, things were made to be used, right? And so if you can't, nobody would recognize, even in the state of nature, a legitimate claim on anything beyond what a person could put to good use. Right. And so, you have to tell, a child like this when you say, oh, look, you can't actually play with all those toys. He's like, yeah, this is how I play with all the toys. I put them into a pile and guard them. He's like, no, that's not putting these things to good use. We don't recognize the legitimacy of that claim. And again, this is just plain common sense. There's no law, right? It says, a kid in a daycare can't like hoard the toys. This is just a sort of thing that would apply exactly in the state of nature, right? Hoarding is not legitimate, property behavior. Right, there's no good reason for other people to recognize your claims in those cases. And so what I want to point out is that Locke's theory of property here is pretty subversive, right? Locke's theory, in a nutshell, is that whatever somebody usefully alters from its natural state is they have just a right of property in that thing, and such a right that would be accepted, again, even in the state of nature, right? Even without laws to tell them so. And Locke's theory of property here is actually pretty subversive. It was subversive in his own time, and it's subversive in ours for a couple of reasons. First, think about it this way: if you think about who owned most of the land in Locke's day, right? They were just sort of coming out of a feudalist structure where the people who own the land are lords, right, essentially, and then most other people, they sort of pay rent to live on and farm that land, right? And so Locke's theory of property sort of implies that it's actually the people who are working the land that own it, not the nominal lords, right? The rent holders, essentially. They're not doing anything useful, and so it's really all these peasants that rightfully owned the land that they worked, and it's not the lords that owned it. So that's a very subversive in Locke's time. But even in our time and many others, this idea that the richest in any society are unjust because what they do is they have more than you can really put to good use. Right, and that there's no reason to recognize that sort of claim of ownership. There's no reason to say, oh yes, that's yours and nobody else's, if it's more than you could possibly put to good use, right? And so that's, again, another way in which Locke's very common sense theory of property is pretty subversive. So for a theory of property based entirely in some, I think, pretty solid common sense, it's not, in fact, the theory of property that is actually held in, as far as I know, any society, though elements of it are found in every society's idea of property. It's very interesting in that sense. Well, so property is very important, and life and liberty are things also that are yours, right? And so those are also things that are very important. Those are all natural rights. And so far we haven't talked about what's so bad about living in the state of nature. It's like, well, it sounds good to me. We've got all this natural law and we've got natural rights. But again, think of how it really goes. We have all these expectations that these are the rules. But how do things go in practice? How do things go among the people who are actually living in the state of nature? And Locke is going to agree with Hobbes that things aren't really very good, and for some of the same reasons that Hobbes points out. If we don't have anybody really to sort of hold a hammer over anybody, then there are a lot of shenanigans. Okay. And so Locke puts it this way. He says, the great and chief purpose of people uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. The state of nature lacks many things that are needed for this, and I shall discuss 3 of them. Right. So if we're going to enumerate some of the biggest problems with the way the state of nature works, here's going to be 3 of those. Locke says, first, the state of nature lacks an established, settled, known law, received and accepted by common consent as the standard of right and wrong and as the common measure to decide all controversies. What about the law of nature, you ask? Well, it is plain and intelligible to all reasonable creatures, but humans are biased by self-interest. Okay, it's a very, very important phrase here. Humans are biased by self-interest, as well as ignorant about the law of nature because they don't study it. And so they aren't apt to accept it as a law that will bind them if it is applied to their particular cases. Right? This is what it means to be sort of biased by self-interest. So think, imagine, like, if there's no real written rules exactly, then the way that everybody sort of, whatever the rules that people sort of pay attention to are the rules that benefit them, right? Or that's what they think the rules are. They think the rules are whatever would be good for them, not necessarily what the rules ought to be, in a more objective sense. Right? He says, look, that's just a problem that people have, and it's a problem that you're going to have, especially in the state of nature. Right, that you've got this sort of this personal bias, right, the self-interest bias. That's one problem. A second problem he points out, he says the state of nature lacks a known and impartial judge with the authority to settle differences according to the established law. In that state, everyone is both judge and enforcer of the law of nature, and few people will play either role well, right? It's another very important phrase. So again, in the state of nature, everybody is both sort of judge and enforcer of the natural law, right? And again, few people are going to be really impartial when their own interests are at stake. Right? When there are disagreements about what the rules are, what the rules mean, who the rules apply to, how they apply, in what sort of cases in which they apply, right? Everybody is pretty well going to pick whichever benefits them the most, right? And think that's the most reasonable interpretation. And that's just automatic. Again, he says people are partial to themselves. And so that passion or revenge are very apt to carry them too far and with too much heat in their own cases, right? And their negligence and lack of concern will make them remiss in others' cases, right? So if there's some major injustice that affects you, you're likely to go way overboard in trying to correct it. Whereas if the same injustice affects somebody else, it's very likely you're not going to do enough, right? Again, that's just a kind of self-serving bias that people have. And so this second major problem, this lack of sort of, judges, essentially impartial judges, is a problem for a very similar reason as the first problem, this lack of rules. Locke continues. He says, thirdly, the state of nature often lacks a power to back up and support a correct sentence and to enforce it properly. People who have committed crimes will usually, if they can, resort to force to retain the benefits of their crime, and this includes using force to resist punishment. Such resistance often makes the punishment dangerous, even destructive, to those who try and inflict it. So again, there's no real impartial rule enforcement here. Again, if you're supposed to just enforce the rules in your own case, again, there's another quote from Locke that bears on this. He says, nobody is going to be, if they're going to be unjust enough to harm one of their brethren, they're not going to be so just as to condemn themselves and punish themselves for it, right? And so he says, look, people do break the rules, but you can't count on people to punish themselves, and punishing somebody else is always, a tricky business in the state of nature. And so, yeah, these are huge, huge problems that make a community in the state of nature virtually unworkable. So while we're at it, let's talk about this idea of self-serving bias, because it's something that Locke pretty intuitively twigged to, right? He was pretty clear that was going on. But it's been very much clinically proven in subsequent years. We've studied it very well. Psychologists have studied many aspects of self-serving bias. It's very well understood and pretty much incontrovertibly true. So one instance of that, and we'll talk about several others, but one instance of self-serving bias is what's often called the Lake Wobegon effect, from a sort of from a kind of sketch, I guess, or a set of stories that are told by Garrison Keillor, a former personality on National Public Radio. Um, and so, Lake Wobegon was a town where, as he put it, where all the men are, all the, as I say, it's all the men are, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, something like that. I don't know. And all the children are above average, right? That's the way the town is like, right? Everyone's good, and all the children are above average, right? Now think about that for a second. How's it, I mean, I guess it's possible for one town to have children who are all above the national average, but if you take any group of children, only half of them will be above the average for that group, right? I mean, that's just, a mathematical certainty, and that's what makes it slightly comedic. But the idea is that we all sort of tend to think of it this way, right? People, if you ask, are you better than the average driver? Almost everybody says that they are. In fact, and that can't be possible. Only half of people can be better than average at driving. You want to say, are you, how good are you at this? How good are you at that? Almost everybody tends to think of, at least of very common things, that they're above average in almost every characteristic, at least desirable characteristics. Certainly better than average in terms of, so you want to say, are you sort of more polite than usual? You're going to say, oh, of course, I'm more polite than average, right? And that's, everybody says so. And I say, well, I'm much less rude than the average person, right? Everybody says that. And of course, that, again, is mathematical impossibility. Only half of people can be sort of less rude than average. But, it's a self-serving bias. People like to think of themselves well, not poorly, so they do. Self-serving assessment comes in a lot of different forms. For example, think if you were in a room of people and I asked, how many of you have put away even $1 for cancer treatment for yourself in the future? Right? How many hands would you expect to go up? I've actually done this in several groups, and I'll tell you, it's not a darn one. Okay, nobody's hand goes up. But then you ask, how many of you bought a lottery ticket? Well, a bunch of hands go up. Okay, again, this is a form of self-serving bias. Because, of course, once I ask you, what are the odds? Like compare the odds here. What are the odds of winning the lottery? You want to say, oh, well, that's really, really low, of course. What are the odds of you getting cancer? And they're like, well, actually, not too bad, right? Almost, lots and lots of people get cancer. Everybody knows somebody who had or has cancer. But almost nobody knows anybody who's ever won the lottery, right? At least not one of the big lottery payouts. And so even though, right, again, this is a form of self-serving bias. People tend to treat very unlikely good things as they think about those, right, but they don't think about the very likely bad things, right, that will happen to them, right? That's, again, a form of self-serving bias. It's sort of painting a very rosy picture of the world for yourself. And it's, it's not rational, but people do it all the time. Students, for example, tend to think of good performance on a test as evidence that they are good students, right? And then bad performance on a test as evidence that the test is unfair. I mean, just like talk to anybody, right? It's like, oh, of course, right? Absolutely. But of course, that sort of self-serving bias isn't confined to just one side of the podium. Teachers tend to attribute student success to their skill as teachers, right? And attribute student failure to some lack of ability or effort on the part of the student. Okay, that's, again, these are all self-serving biases. They're tremendously common. And so at this point, we want to talk about how to solve some of the problems that we see in the state of nature. And this will sort of sum up Locke here. And so Locke says it would be rational. Any rational person would agree to exchange the freedom of the state of nature for the security of society. And so what Locke proposes in terms of some concrete roles for government to play, right? So again, people recognize an expectation that they have these natural rights, these rights to life, liberty, and property, even in the state of nature. But the state of nature itself doesn't do very much to protect those rights. What they have to do is they have to give up some of their natural freedom and put themselves in a society, put themselves under government, so that they can more concretely protect those things. And the way to protect those rights is to get self-serving bias out of the equation. That's a big thing for Locke. And so specifically, he says there's three roles, right, that a government can play that should never be played by self-interested parties. Okay? So for example, a legislative role of government. That is, whoever's making the rules, we have to do everything we can to make sure and to try and keep it the way that the people who are making the rules aren't making them to benefit themselves, but rather making rules that in general have a benefit to, to as many as they can benefit. Certainly no set of rules benefits everybody equally, right? But the idea is to make sure that as many, you get as much input into the system as possible, and that the rules aren't being made for the people who are making the rules. Okay, and this corresponds very, very much with Plato's argument that the whole point of government is to look out for the people who are being governed, not for the people doing the governing. Okay, and that has to, you have to be vigilant about that, because human nature is what it is. You have to make sure to keep people from making rules that benefit themselves or people like them, instead of just, sort of making things that have broad benefit. Okay, so there's that legislative piece that should be liberated from self-serving bias. That should be what any good government's going to do, is make a set of rules that's in general good for as many people as it can be. There has to be an executive that isn't simply self-serving, somebody to enforce the rules. And the idea is they can't enforce the rules in a way that benefits them, right? So for example, and for the most part, this is done very well. You think of a modern, police force, for example. The police are not writing you a parking ticket because it benefits them to write you a parking ticket. Not in any direct way, certainly. In a very indirect way, I guess part of their budgets come from, like fines and things like that. But, honestly, it's not personal, right? It's and shouldn't be. Where punishment and crime, or enforcement of law is really personal for the law enforcement, that's inappropriate. And it's pretty clear, right? Ask any cop, is it personal? It's like, well, no, it's not personal. This is my job. We have rules, and it's my job to enforce those rules as best as I can to everybody, right? And so any sort of bias that creeps in there is something that we try very, very hard to root out. And then finally, we need to have a judicial system where, again, the judges shouldn't have any stake in the current case. Things shouldn't go better for them or worse for them, no matter how they rule, right? They shouldn't have any interest in the ultimate outcome. They should try and rule impartially, right? And that's, again, without any self-serving bias. Okay, and that's, again, we have to work very hard to make that be the case, and we have lots and lots and lots and lots of procedures that are designed to do just that, right? Almost all of jurisprudence is designed to try and avoid the problems you have when people are judges in their own cases, right? Where people have a kind of, a benefit that they get out of ruling one way or another. And so if we can liberate, right, certain of these core functions from self-interested bias, then we see that these are some of the core functions of what a government should do. And I don't know if that looks familiar at all to you, this whole legislative, executive, judicial thing, but you've probably seen it somewhere.